first like to start with the question, why read Heidegger at all? It seems really difficult, and maybe the sort of thing that is very hard to get any useful knowledge or perspective from. And even beyond that, there's the problem with Heidegger, which is that Heidegger had made some very bad choices in his life in terms of his political orientation, in terms of some of the things that he wrote. It's interesting. These days, it's pretty common to have this situation where we reevaluate the influence of certain historical figures, intellectual figures, or political figures, and so on, in the light of what we now consider to be acceptable or unacceptable social formation. So, for instance, the fact that it's a big point of discussion these days in Schenkerian analysis, in the as Luis knows, bringing Schenker's theories on race and the various hierarchical rankings of different cultures and this sort of thing to bear on what he actually had to say as a music theorist. And the basic question is it possible to, in some sense, isolate the theoretical side from the more problematic side, the more chauvinistic, racist side? And that's a real point of contention. Now, one of the things that's interesting about cases like Schenker, or you could talk about quite a variety of other thinkers and intellectuals and political figures and so on, is that by and large, most of them were making statements, had a worldview that at the time was not necessarily deemed as being terribly problematic. And so, that's one question. At the time that Schenker was writing, there were these ideas in the air that were popular, and perhaps we shouldn't lay all the blame on Schenker or something like that. That's basically one of the arguments that is often made. The case with Heidegger is quite different. Heidegger was a Nazi, and he joined the Nazi Party. He used his Nazi affiliation to gain a certain amount of stature in his career, gain influence and so on in the university that he worked at and so on. And the thing that's interesting about that is that at that time, following the war, Heidegger was basically seen as a somewhat, how shall I say, nefarious influence, perhaps, because the thing is that after the war, everyone already understood that Nazism was a bad thing. So it wasn't that there was some historical period where everything was all right in the way that an apologist for someone like Heinrich Schenker might assert. Heidegger already during his life made the choice to join the Nazi Party, and then after the Second World War was kicked out of his university position and more or less censored for around a decade or so. And so even during Heidegger's life, there was this question about the relationship of his intellectual work to the policies and the ideology of the Nazi regime. He also seemed to be sort of a pragmatic careerist and did seem to harbor certain affinities and sympathies for the underlying ideology of Nazism. So it's a tricky situation when you're encountering Heidegger. It's something to be aware of. I will say that among the most interesting attempts to link Heidegger's thought to Nazism is some of the work by Theodor Adorno. There's a work by Adorno called The Jargon of Authenticity, in which he tries to link a certain facet of Heidegger's, how shall I say, ethics. It's a little, whenever you talk about Heidegger's ethics, there's always a question mark, not only because he was a Nazi and so on, but because he specifically expressed his disinterest in ethics. He didn't think that ethics was really much of a worthwhile pursuit. He was very influential, as I said, in the, not in the formation of existentialism, but the existentialists like Sartre and Camus both looked to him as an inspiration, even though Heidegger publicly distanced himself from Sartre. When Sartre wrote when he wrote Existentialism as a Humanism, it's one of Sartre's most famous pamphlets about existentialism, Heidegger comes out and says that he's not an existentialist. So it's a little bit difficult to describe exactly what the relationship is between Heidegger and existentialism. I'll spend a moment on that. But to the extent that Heidegger has anything ethical to say, his ethics is oriented towards how to live your life, how to construct the narrative of your existence in relationship to your limitations and the experience of possibility in life. And for Heidegger to do that, if you're able to live in such a way that you commit yourself to your projects, shades of Kierkegaard again, but if you commit yourself to your projects in a way that is not superficial and stereotypical with an eye towards your own mortality, then that is a way of authentically being who you are. And so this idea of authenticity is the closest thing that Heidegger gets to an ethic in his work. And this ethics of authenticity is something that Adorno links to Nazism. He thinks that there's something structural about Heidegger's theory of authenticity, being an authentic individual, that if it doesn't necessarily move one into a Nazi framework, it certainly doesn't preclude the idea that if you follow an ethics of authenticity, that you could also become a Nazi. I'll spend a moment talking about that as we go through this worksheet. I will say that there's one other thing about Heidegger which I think is really useful for aesthetics. And this comes to the question of truth. We spent a little bit of time talking about truth, mimesis, and so on last week. And we saw a couple different approaches to the question of whether there's a relationship between art and truth. You remember for Plato, art is just mimetic. And because it's an imitation of the world we find around us, the world of appearance, which is itself an imitation of the forms, that art is really just a lie. And it might be a noble lie. It might be a lie that makes people act in a good way. But it might as well also just be a lie that makes people act in a bad way, in a self-interested way or pleasure-seeking way or something like that. And so for Plato, art is really just a form of untruth. Art is a lie. And then for Nietzsche, the question of truth is a bit more complicated because he thinks that to the extent that we think of statements as possibly being true or not, that's always metaphorical. There's always something metaphorical in saying something about the world, building a model of our experience that we take to correspond to the world. That's always basically a poetic move. So that art actually is prior to truth. That's something that we see with Nietzsche. With Heidegger, we get a different understanding of truth, which I think is probably maybe the most interesting and the most useful. Heidegger has this idea of truth as unconcealing. He uses the word aletheia for this. If you know the river, there's the river Styx, and then there's the river Lethe. And souls pass through the river. The river Styx is the river of death, but the river Lethe is the river of forgetfulness. So that when spirits pass into the underworld, they pass through the waters of the Lethe and forget their worldly existences and so on. So the Lethe, from Greek lethein, which is the verb to get, is part of the idea in concealment. And what Heidegger says is that art engages in a sort of unconcealment, in aletheia, so an unforgetting. Now, what he means by this is basically, I mean, if I were just going to sum it up in a really trite way, I would say that art is true to the extent that it reveals to us something about our relationship to the world, what we take to be valuable in the world, and even how it is that the world, as we find it, shows up to us in the way that it does. The fact that, for instance, we take certain things as the things that they are. For instance, I could give you a long piece of wood with a metallic head on it. Maybe the back end of it's a little bit sharp. Maybe the front end's a little bit flat or something like that. What is the thing that I just handed you?
It's a hammer.
It's a hammer. But how is it that it shows up to you as a hammer?
Well, Heidegger says it's all the other, like the whole semiotic web surrounding the hammer that makes
the hammer.
Right.
In fact, there's this background situation that we live in, our culture, our society, but also even just in the way that we interact with the world. We're able to manage our way in the world. We're able to navigate the world without thinking too much about it, which means that we're already engaged in a certain sort of knowledgeable coping or knowledgeable engagement with the world, whether or not we even think about it. So, the fact that, for instance, you're sitting where you are, probably you're not thinking about the floor right now, unless I specifically draw your attention to the floor, or you're not thinking specifically about the fact that you're breathing, or the fact that you're blinking, or all these various things that you're doing in a really, I suppose, expert way. You're engaging in this sort of knowledge, perhaps based or knowledge-laden way of interacting with the world that all works quite well. And this is the background situation. So that the background exists in this relationship of all sorts of things interacting with other things, objects interacting with other objects, human beings interacting with objects, and so on. And for the most part, that's sort of the world that we exist in. I would say that Heidegger might describe that as something more like the earth. He has this difference between the earth and the world, but I'll spend a moment talking about that. But basically, there is a background situation that's constantly at work that entails all sorts of values about the world, all sorts of ways of encountering the world that we don't even necessarily think about. And what a work of art can do is, by taking some aspect of the world as we are just in it unreflectively and putting it into some artistic situation, artistic context, it reveals something about our relationship to the objects in the world, our relationship to other people, our relationship to the whole system, the background system that we're always constantly operating in. And this is more or less what he describes as truth, the truth aspect, or the truthing, the truthiness of the artwork. It's this way that it reveals to us what we take the world to be, unreflectively. And not only what we take it to be, but what we actually value, what we find valuable in the world. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this, which if you made it all the way through the article by Hubert Dreyfus, you might have noticed when Hubert Dreyfus is quoting an excerpt from Heidegger where he's talking about the various ways that truth as revealing, truth as uncovering, aletheia, can more or less be articulated. And one of the things he says is that truth as unconcealment might be articulated in the formation of a state. And then Hubert Dreyfus in brackets says, as examples for Heidegger, presumably Pericles, the Athenian legislator, and then perhaps Hitler. because Heidegger was a Nazi. One of the things that, it's a very striking moment in that article. One of the things that pops out to me about that is that this idea of truth as revealing for Heidegger must be, well, how shall I say this? For us, at least, seems to be value neutral. I think that Heidegger probably did think at some point, maybe before the end of the Second World War, probably did think the new state that Hitler was bringing into existence was probably a good thing. But what I see there, but of course, then Heidegger comes to renounce his Nazi affiliation, blah, blah, blah. And maybe that was all completely pragmatic because he wanted to start publishing again and so on, who knows. But the thing that I am describing here is that the way that revealing can work in order to reveal to us what we value about the world, what we take for granted about the world, is potentially value neutral. It may not be about being good or bad. And so if truth in the establishment of the Nazi state is a way in which truth brings into consciousness or brings into awareness certain things that we value about the world, that's just a completely neutral statement as regards value. What I mean by this is that any political organization, well, maybe I'll ask you, how is it that starting a new country, a new state, how would that reveal to a people or to whoever's creating the laws of the state, how would that be an act of revealing the world and the relationship that those people have to the world? How does that bring that into light, into focus? The creation of a new state.
Well, they would have to decide based on, experiences and also, based on history of what other people have done. But they would have to decide for themselves what they value and implement that in some kind of meaningful way that can be enforced.
Yeah, like for instance, you look at the Constitution and it seems pretty clear that the founding fathers, even though they talked about all men being equal, they didn't really have equality as a fundamental value. It seems like some conception of freedom was the ultimate value when you read the Constitution. And the writing of the Constitution is simply a way of bringing into the foreground the background assumptions, beliefs, and values that were in their world. And the laying down of laws is a way simply of articulating that. So when Dreyfus gives the example of Hitler as an articulation of Heidegger's conception of truth, he's not saying that it's good or bad. What he's saying is simply that the Nazi state was an articulation of a certain set of values and assumptions about the world. And that's really interesting because almost invariably, we tend to conflate ideas of truth and goodness. This idea that the true is the good. I mean, this for Plato, this is actually something that he explicitly states, that the true is the good. For Heidegger, that's not, it seems clearly not the case. And this is probably why Heidegger, or at least is connected to the fact that Heidegger is not that interested in ethics. I don't think he thinks of human activity in the world as being good or bad on a moral level. There's something sort of morally neutral about what he's doing. And this is one of the reasons that his ethics, to the extent that they exist at all, is completely compatible with Nazism. Because it's not really about, as we talked about before, this idea that you could use reason to discover for yourself what the right thing to do is, what goodness is. If the true and the good are not the same thing. And in fact, if it's possible to have a theory of truth simply as revealing to you what is important to you in your life, that's basically what authenticity is. It's this idea that to be authentic is to come into an awareness of what you value, what you take to be important, what you commit yourself to. But if that is neither good nor bad, if the only ought is that you be authentic, then it's completely compatible with fascism or any sort of project that might cause a lot of suffering, even the extermination of a people could be the sort of thing that if it's done authentically could conceivably be amenable to the concept of authenticity. And this is really the problem that Adorno is pointing out in the jargon of authenticity. Yeah, Jay.
Does this mean that technically Heidegger is compatible with, like, say, Nietzsche?
I think that there are certain aspects of both of them that are compatible. Is there anything in particular that you want to point out?
I just was thinking if, like, or I guess it seems like a similar thing when we were looking at Nietzsche. We said that Nietzsche said things are meaningful because we say they're meaningful. Mm-hmm. And here Heidegger seems to be reinforcing that. Yeah,
I think that Heidegger has a sense that truth is not something that is mind independent, right? That truth isn't, when we typically, a person on the street uses the word true, typically what they have in mind, even though they might not know that this is what they're doing, they have implicitly a correspondence theory of truth at work, which is that they make statements about the world and they presume that those statements somehow latch onto the world in some corresponding way. There's snow, snow is white in the world, regardless of whether or not people exist. And if I say snow is white, it's a statement about the snow that corresponds to the structure of the snow, the properties of the snow, and so on. And so there's this correspondence where my language, my way of thinking about the world hooks onto the world. And that's the sort of unreflective theory of truth that most people have. It has all sorts of problems because nobody can develop a good theory for that hooking on function of truth. How is it that words, phonemes, muscle movements, this sort of thing somehow hooks on to the essence, the essential nature of reality? That's one problem with that theory. The other problem is that, from the Enlightenment tradition post-Kant, how would we ever know if the way that we think about the world or the way we experience the world actually corresponds exactly to the way the world is? Shouldn't it be the case that the way we see the world, or the way we think about the world, perhaps filters some aspect of the world, so that flies or, I don't know, aliens or whatever may have a very different idea of what is real than we would have, and it's just a function of our eyes, ears, minds, brains, and so on, that are structured in a certain way that give us the sense that the things we say about the world actually do correspond to the world. But how would you ever know for certain? Now, what Heidegger is doing is developing a theory of truth that is much different from that, because for him, truth has to do with revealing to us what we already take to be, how we take the world to be already. And it's something that arises in a culture, perhaps. It's not that individual minds necessarily can just by fiat, create a new sort of background situation for everyone. Cultures, in some sense, are the background situation, but they're the background situation because everybody is engaged in a communal project. A sort of project of shared practices, shared assumptions about what's important, how the world actually is, these sorts of things. So it may not be just the sort of thing that an individual can come along and change willy-nilly whenever they want. But the point is that there doesn't seem to be any sort of bedrock foundation that is mind independent, right? That if truth is just revealing to us the way that we have a relationship to the world, our relationship to the world, the uncovering of that is truth, then that's always going to be dependent on the way we relate to the world. So to a certain extent, yeah, there is something similar in what Nietzsche has to say about truth to what Heidegger has to say. I think that Heidegger has a more sophisticated and interesting analysis for the way that a work of art does that act of revealing to us. This year, I decided to give you a different article. In the past, I've often taught this article by Heidegger called The Origin of the Artwork, which really unpacks in a really very nuanced and interesting and Byzantine way how the artwork, or work of art, can take material reality and somehow through aesthetic means illuminate material reality such that we come to see it in a new light, and that coming to see the thing in the new light contextualizes to us our relationship to the things in the world, because now the things in the world are defamiliarized. They're in some sense put into a context that maintains their material existence. You look at, I don't know, a wooden sculpture or something, and you still see the wood. I mean, it's not that a wooden sculpture is completely, like some sort of mystical, transcendent spiritual experience. I mean, when you encounter a work of art, it actually has physical existence. Or in the case of music, it's actual physical sounds. The instruments have physicality and materiality to them. But that the way an artwork works through the material that it's based in defamiliarizes the material world to us, such that we come into a different relationship to these objects that we know from our normal experience, but now they have somehow become illuminated to us, and that there's this illuminated relationship to the world or something. What's that?
We sort of get that from the Dreyfus.
Mm-hmm.
That's
why I gave you that article, because it's a little bit easier to read than the original article, The Origin of the Artwork. But yeah. Okay, well, let's do a brief run through of some of the things. I've already mentioned a few things here on this handout, just sort of in free form, but it might be a little bit interesting to talk about phenomenology and its history and its applications. It's interesting, the optional article that I gave you sounds, when you read it, especially with thinking from the background of phenomenology, it sounds like the research project was to develop a cognitive scientific approach to the insights gained from phenomenology, but they don't ever mention Heidegger by name. I think the word phenomenology appears once in the writing, but it's funny that all of the problems that they're dealing with in that article are exactly the sort of problems that people like Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger are working with. So there's, beyond Heidegger's influence in philosophy and literary criticism, his project also has an afterlife in cognitive science in all sorts of domains. I think that the way that he got into cognitive science, the way Heidegger's influence gets into cognitive science, is probably through the work of Hubert Dreyfus, who's the author of that article that I gave you. Hubert Dreyfus is, well, he just died a couple years ago. He's an interesting guy, though. He was probably, at least North America's leading expert on phenomenology and Heidegger in general. He did original translations, the first English translation of some of Foucault's work, some of Merleau-Ponty's work, but he's really famous for his work in artificial intelligence. Hubert Dreyfus wrote this book in the 70s called What Computers Can't Do. And then in the 90s, there was a second version called What Computers Still Can't Do. And it was a critique of classical artificial intelligence that posited basically that if we think of consciousness as basically being an algorithm, then we miss out on the actual complexity of human consciousness. Because what Heidegger is basically saying in his work is related to this idea of a background situation, that before we have any sort of rule, any sort of proposition about what we're doing, conscious knowledge of what we're doing, our knowledge is already embedded and embodied in our practices. That the fact that you can walk down the street and then walk up your driveway or walk into your apartment building, you open the door, you walk into your apartment, you sit down, and during all that time, there are all sorts of coordinations of muscles to do the walk-in, to do the opening of the door. You don't even notice the doorknob as you're opening it, especially if you're thinking about something else, that all of that is knowledge that is not cognitive knowledge. It's embodied knowledge. And Heidegger's basic idea is that before we ever get to anything like a theory of truth or even a theory of human activity or something like that, we already have a theory of human activity in the fact that we're already active in the world. And so this idea of the situation as being this background on the level of just cognitive functioning in the world, the fact that we can navigate the world at all, presupposes that we have some embodied knowledge, or knowledge is maybe not quite the right word, but some embodied proficiency or I suppose ability to interact in the world that is not cognitive, algorithmic, heuristic, this sort of thing. And so Dreyfus's attack on traditional AI was that it was basically too schematic, that it was positing human consciousness as basically like a set of rules, a set of propositions that follow logically from each other, this sort of thing. And that's not the best way to think about human functioning in the world, because human functioning, human knowledge arises out of biological activity. So anyway, and it came to pass that many of the predictions he made about heuristic or algorithmic AI, the various problems that he predicted would come up in the field, he was right about almost everything. And so he became very famous for a time in the AI community and also in the cognitive science community. And it's just a sort of improbable moment where a scholar of a body of work, existentialism, phenomenology, that we normally take to be the domain of aesthetics or literary criticism or this sort of thing, actually had major contributions to make to the world of artificial intelligence. So it's a sort of improbable career path that he had. But anyway, this is all just to flesh out that question: why read Heidegger? Not necessarily because we like him or that we want to follow him, but just to get a very strong sense of the influence in the world, at least the intellectual world as we find it. And also I would say that to simply deny that someone who made terrible life choices and harbored all sorts of racist biases can't say something that's true just because of that is actually a logical fallacy. It's an ad hominem fallacy. So it's an invitation for us to read someone that we might have an antagonistic feeling towards charitably. And I will say, I brought up the idea of reading an article charitably a few times already. Reading something charitably is not necessarily only to be taken as a sort of as being other directed or the sort of thing that's not self-interested. To read something charitably is also just to ask the question, how is this helpful to me? In order to get anything useful out of a difficult article or an article you might not agree with, the only thing that you can do is ask, okay, so what about this is helpful to me? And so that is one way of thinking about reading someone charitably that you might not like very much. What about Heidegger can we use that will be helpful to us? There's one other thing I was going to say, but it slipped out of my mind. All right, let's dig really briefly into some of the things here on the handout that I didn't talk about yet. I'll try to go quickly through this because I want to get to the readings too. But let's start with Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl was Heidegger's teacher and was very influential in getting Heidegger's major work, Being and Time, published. Edmund Husserl was a very interesting figure because he studied astronomy, mathematics, physics, studied psychology with Brentano, who was also Sigmund Freud's teacher. And what Husserl wants to do is to save logic, save rationality from a certain view of the world that takes logic to be something that arises out of the natural world. Now, what I mean by this is that he wants to save logic from psychology. He wants to construct a system and an argument that will protect logic as a completely autonomous domain from psychology, from human psychology understood as a biological emergent, set of abilities or actions or this sort of thing. Why do you think it's so important to him as a mathematician, as someone who seems very much to be a Platonic sort of thinker, that there is a true essence to the world that is available to us through logic? Why would it be so important to him to protect it from a theory of logic that posits that logic is really just something that evolves along with human psychology, that it's something that emerges out of human psychology? Can anybody think of why that would be so important?
I mean, just his background alone means that he values logic. I mean, I have an undergraduate degree in mathematics, and I mean, we have to spend a whole semester on just logic classes. And so every argument that we make has to kind of branches from that. So, I mean, his whole world look is that if this, then this holds a true value to him. Whereas psychology it's not always guaranteed that if I have a bad upbringing, I will be crazy or I will murder, people or whatever. And so that fuzzy logic really bothers him.
Yeah, well, I think what you're describing is the difference between necessity and contingency. Logic, understanding that there are certain necessary foundations to logic, that if something is necessarily true, that it is true and cannot possibly be false. If that's the sort of thing that only arises out of psychology, which is a contingent process, human psychology didn't have to evolve the way it did. It could have evolved in all sorts of different ways. If the idea that there are such things as necessary truths, logically necessary truths that cannot possibly be false, if we believe that that is just something that grows out of human psychology as a biological phenomenon, then it means that necessity is impossible. Necessity is going to be predicated on the contingency of a biological process, which is itself contingent. And this is what he's trying to protect. He's trying to give an answer to Nietzsche, basically. Nietzsche, who says, well, there are no foundations. The true is just another way of describing what we like, according to Nietzsche. Everything is contingent. What Husserl wants to do is say, no, there is some limit to logic that is mind independent. That even if there were no human minds at all, that logic would still, certain logical laws would still obtain, would still have their force. So this is what he's really trying to do. He's trying to find a science of logic. But what he does, very interestingly, is to base the science of logic in intuition. He takes intuition as a first principle in logic. The science of logic that's based on intuition, he calls phenomenology, which is just a logos of the phenomenon, logos of phenomena, which basically just means a rational and strictly logical system for describing how it is that human consciousness has experience. Phenomenon, if we talk about a phenomenon, what phenomenon basically means is that which appears to us. So a phenomenology is going to be a science of appearance, which is very interesting if you think about what Plato was doing, right? Where Plato thinks that appearance and truth are diametrically opposed. Appearance is a lie. Truth is somehow the sort of thing that we can only grasp with the mind, not with visual or auditory or any other sort of experience. What Husserl in phenomenology is trying to do is create a science, a logic of the appearance, to somehow situate truth, this logically necessary foundation, in experience itself. Now, when I say that he takes intuition as the basis for a rigorous science, it may sound a little bit strange, especially since we're coming from, the English-speaking world that has a tradition of thinking of intuition as something very, very fuzzy. When you say you have an intuition of something, it means that you're not quite sure, you have this uncanny feeling, perhaps. That's not how Husserl is using intuition. The way that Husserl uses intuition is basically to describe the sorts of experiences that are directly available to us in consciousness. What is directly available to us? And so he takes that to be the sort of thing about which we can't possibly be wrong. Now, let me give you an example of this. Normally in, say, empirical science, we would do observational experiments where we would, drop things off a bridge and measure their airspeed or something like that. We're making things happen, we're observing what happens, we're describing what happens, we're describing the world in terms of a set of facts that we observe and so on. But what's interesting about that is that before all of the facts that we're describing, we're already engaged in one other fact that we're not describing, namely observation itself. Right? And so when I talk about intuition as something that's directly available to us, what I'm describing is some aspect of experience that is foundational, where we couldn't even do a scientific experiment without having the foundation, for instance, of experience, without the foundation of observation. Let me give you maybe a more intuitive example of this. If you wanted to do a scientific experiment to answer this question, what would you do? And first of all, we could even ask, are you able to answer this question at all? I could ask you, do I have a headache? What do you think?
Yes.
How do you know? In fact, it seems very strange. If you were to tell me, no, you don't have a headache, we did an MRI and we can't find any brain activity that would correspond, or any, the blood circulation in your head, we can't find anything that would correspond to you having a headache. That doesn't help me very much if I really do have a headache. You see, there's something about my experience of the headache that is fundamental, that even if I'm wrong about it, there's no way that I can be wrong about it because I'm experiencing it, right? It's sort of like, you think about like phantom limbs or something like that. You cut off a limb in the Civil War, the guy says, oh, I feel my leg. And the doctor comes by and says, oh, don't worry, we cut that leg off. There's nothing to worry about. Well, that doesn't help very much because he does feel that pain. And even if you can show, look, there's nothing that we can point to. There's no fact about the matter that we can see from outside that corresponds to you feeling your leg or feeling a headache or some other basic experience like that. There's no way that you can disprove to me, for instance, that I have a headache or that I feel the pain, because I do it. And in fact, I can't even be wrong about it, because even if it's not there, it's still there because I'm experiencing it. Does that make sense? This is what Husserl means by intuition. This is the sort of bedrock of experience that he's taken to be fundamental. And what's really interesting about this is that if we want to really have a rigorous logical system that undergirds observational science, then we have to have a theory of observation first. And the theory of observation is going to have a theory of experience. And it's going to take as its first principle the idea that first personal experience, as long as it is of the following sort, a perception that is combined with some sort of belief structure, that you don't just perceive the thing, but that you actually also believe that you're perceiving the thing, that this is going to be the sort of thing that is irrefutable. maybe I'll put it another way, because this is really just a way of kind of gussying up in a slightly more modern way the project of Rene Descartes and the cogito. You know, the statement, I think, therefore I am. Yeah, I think, therefore I am. What does that mean?
If you're able to consider if you are, then you must be.
The fact
if
that
you're able to have thought, then you must exist.
The fact that thinking is happening means that something must exist. Now, there's some question about whether it's an I, an ego, or something like that. We don't know exactly what exists, or if it's a process versus a verb instead of a noun. These are things that Descartes just assumes. What Descartes says, because I'm even raising the question if I exist at all, that necessarily shows that I exist. There are some aspects of that that don't logically follow from that. But what does logically follow is that if thinking is happening, something exists, or there is some sort of activity, right? And this is taken to be the sort of thing that you can't refute, because what does it mean to refute that? You could sort of say, well, I don't accept that, but then you're in a sea of silence where you can't even communicate. This is sort of like Aristotle's law of identity. If you reject it, then you're at a complete loss. There is nothing more that can be said. And this is really what Husserl's doing in phenomenology. He's trying to take experience, instead of saying, I think, therefore I am, what Husserl would say is, I experience, therefore I am. That first personal experience, there's something fundamental and irrefutable about it. Now, this doesn't mean that subjective experience is therefore true for every person on Earth, because there's a difficulty of trying to connect the subjective world, the internal world of thought, of experience, of intuition, direct intuition, with the external world. And this is the sort of problem that in philosophy we've seen all the time, right? Whenever we have this idea of emerging out of the situation, emerging out of nature, such that you can then describe the situation, describe nature, that there's always this positing of nature and then the internal world of the person thinking about it. And the difficulty in continental philosophy based in this sort of internal reflection, is that it's very hard to get from the internal world of sense perception, of knowing that you are perceiving a thing, to any statement about the external world. I'd say in empirical science, it's the opposite problem. If you start with the external world as fundamental, the things you observe in the external world, it's very hard to then move from external observations to things about interior experience, things like values, beliefs about good and evil, and this sort of thing. It's very hard to move from external empirical science to some sort of theory of subjectivity or value and this sort of thing. But what Husserl is trying to do is to take experience as the foundation for a rigorous, strictly logical, strictly mathematical approach to science. And what he's trying to do, this aspect of getting to the bedrock experience that we have, that human subjects are capable of having, involves this process that he describes in terms of, well, actually, maybe before I get to epoche, which is down here, I'll say a couple things about logical investigations now that I look about this. A couple things that I've said. One of the things that we get from this idea that our experiences are foundational, fundamental, is this idea that whenever we experience something, or whenever we are conscious of anything, we're always conscious of something. This is the sort of thing that is interesting. I mean, is it possible to think of nothing? See, if you try to think of nothing, are you thinking? Are you not thinking? Or are you thinking of nothing? Husserl is basically saying it's impossible to think of nothing, or to be conscious of nothing. To be conscious of nothing is simply to just not be conscious. And so there's this idea that within consciousness, there's already this relationship to the external world, that the very act of consciousness is a relationship to the active consciousness of a subject, but then the relationship to the thing of which one is conscious. And it's really interesting because Descartes has the problem of sort of solipsism, where if we take that the only thing that we know irrefutably about the world is that I exist, then that means that what is foundationally true in Descartes' method is the position of the subject, the interior world of the subject, studying the outside world. So you have this very drastic separation of the mind and the world in Descartes. This is known as dualism. What Husserl is trying to do is maintain that same sort of foundationalism that you have in Descartes, that we do have sense perceptions, experiences that are irrefutable because there are experiences, but he's trying to then connect it to the outside world. And the way that he's trying to do that is by saying that whenever we have an experience of something, it's exactly that. It's an experience of something. And the reason I put down here experience of, not yet as, is because this is going to become important with Heidegger. Because for Heidegger, remember, normally when we're engaged in activity, we don't even consciously experience the things that we are using, that we're interacting with. I mean, how deeply are you contemplating the floor or your chair or the feeling of your tongue in your mouth or this sort of thing right now? The vast majority of objects we encounter in the world are not yet appearing to us as something, as the thing that they are. And what Husserl is trying to do is get to something that's even more fundamental than, for instance, seeing a can as a can. He's trying to get to the pure experience of the can as the foundational sort of thing. And this is going to be really important when we look at phenomenology's relationship to music in the 20th century. This idea of bracketing out everything that is not essential to the experience is that process of the phenomenological reduction. It's this thing listed right under ideas pertaining to a pure phenomenology. What he's trying to do, what Husserl's trying to do, is get to this bedrock foundational certainty of experience. And in order to do that, he has to bracket out everything, which includes, for instance, the names that we give things. Instead of seeing this as a can, I try to look at it and logically bracket out everything that, in the strict mathematical sense of bracketing a problem, try to bracket out everything that is not proper to the experience itself. Can, as a concept, is not proper to the experience. It's something that's external. So that when I think of this thing as a can that has certain uses, certain meaning, this sort of thing, I'm not dealing with the pure experience, the bedrock experience. So what he's trying to do is filter out everything, create this rigorously logical system that will enable him to bracket out everything that is not an essential aspect or essential property of experience itself. Now, why is this important for us? This idea is really influential for people like Pierre Schaeffer. The idea of the objet sonore, the sound object in musique concrète. If you've ever dealt with musique concrète at all, you may have encountered this idea of the sound object. The sound object, Schaeffer had his fingers in Husserl. He was reading Husserl when he was developing these ideas. The sound object is an attempt to experience sound in this reduced way. Trying to experience sound, not in terms of what caused the sound, not in terms of what the sound means, not in terms of how you might use the sound or how you might relate to the sound, but just to experience the pure, I suppose, phenomenon. I was about to say cognition, but it's not even a cognition. It's not the sort of thing that you predicate truth of or falsity of. It's just the pure phenomenal experience of sound itself. This is what the sound object is in musique concrète. And it's this way of coming into what Schaeffer thinks of as the essential purity of sound or something like this. One of the things about musique concrète is that, it's acousmatic, which means that we don't see the objects that create the sounds. They're just recorded on magnetic tape. And so the visual sources are separated from the sounds, which means that it's harder to pinpoint exactly what the sound is. It's hard to locate the as of the sound. What I mean by that is you hear or something like that. And you don't know, was it an elephant? Was it a jet engine? Was it it doesn't matter, because none of the sound as you hear it is not an as. It's just a pure phenomenal experience of the sound in its purest form or something like that. I think there's something very similar in the way that Cage talks about sound coming to its own when he's talking about getting rid of the glue, getting rid of all the cognitive strategies that we have for structuring a piece of music and just coming into like a pure, direct, unmediated experience of sound. What he's describing is the phenomenological reduction. He's talking about trying to bracket out meaning, trying to bracket out cause and effect, trying to bracket out the asness, the identities of sounds, and just somehow get into a pure, unmediated relationship to the sound. I mean, there's something kind of similar in transcendental meditation too, where you try to hear, or you try to focus on your breath, for instance, not as your breath, not as the sort of thing that keeps you alive, that has this causality to it, but just as the pure phenomenon of breathing, and it's supposed to clear the mind or something like that. It's this idea of somehow getting to this bedrock foundational, for Husserl, this foundational truth that is ideal and essential in a Platonic way. But of course, it's interesting that it's an ideal that's based in experience. It's an ideal that's based in appearances, which is quite different from what Plato's project is. Next, here I have these two concepts of Husserl, which are kind of important. The idea of noesis and noema, which I think are really interesting to consider if you read the optional article, the article about the cognitive science approach to immersion and presencing and this sort of thing. And this is also important for Heidegger and this idea of this background situation, this world that we're in, whether it comes to consciousness or not. Whenever we perceive something, there's always a background act of perception that's going on. So that, you are in the world, you're experiencing things. I see my hand moving back and forth in front of my face, and I see it as my hand and as me doing the thing. There's this sense that my experience of the world is not just an image that is, that I'm watching on a screen or something, but that the image is somehow embedded in my mind, that I'm completely immersed in the act of perception. This is noesis. This is this idea that there's always this background situation of perceiving that has this quality of being immersed in the experience or in the act of perception, and that noema is the perceptual content, the as of what you see, the presence to consciousness of the things that you see. So there's this act of perceiving, this background situation where you're not even necessarily conscious of the act of perceiving. Like if I ask you, just like I ask you, okay, concentrate on the fact that you're breathing, or concentrate on the fact that you're blinking. Now I'll ask you, concentrate on the fact that you're perceiving. What you're trying to do is access the noetic or the noesis of perceiving, that background situation that's always there that brings perceptions to consciousness, but that we're not actually consciously aware of. It's sort of like pre-conscious, pre-reflective. In that article about presence in virtual worlds, it's really interesting because one of the claims they make there is that presencing, the feeling of being present in a world, not just watching a world from an external position, but actually being immersed in that world so that it actually feels like you're in the world, is something that I would say is probably for Husserl at the level of noesis, right? It's this feeling of being embedded in the act of perceiving. It's that background situation that we're already embedded in. And one of the claims that they make in that article is that you can be conscious without having the feeling of presence in your situation. There are certain neurological disorders where that happens, but you can't have a feeling of presence if you're not conscious. That's one of the things I said. And for me, it's sort of interesting because I have a distinct experience that I have sometimes. I think I've talked to Jay about this. I think the term for this is like depersonalization, where when I'm in an experience that is different, weird, maybe really hyper-stimulating or something, I slip into this experience of being in the moment of experience, seeing the things that are happening in front of me, and yet feeling like I'm not the one who's experiencing them. Maybe more people than just me have this experience. But what happens in that situation, I think, is that I'm probably in the situation of bringing the noetic, the perceptual act, that background to consciousness. So that instead of just seeing the things around me as the content of my perception, the actual act of perception becomes part of the content of what I'm perceiving. And it's this very weird experience because if the background is then raised to consciousness, for me, and what I think they're describing in this article is it involves a loss of the feeling of being present in the experience, which is interesting, which means that in the case of being conscious but not having the sense of presence, it's not clear to me that you don't have presence. It's just that you're making presence a noematic content. You're trying to raise the experience itself, or you're doing it automatically, perhaps. You're raising the active experience in the background situation of the cognitive processes that happen before consciousness to the level of consciousness, such that you become aware of the background structure itself. Does that make any sense? It's a very strange situation because you would think that if you make the background situation clearer, like if you bring the background act of perception, if you focus on the perception, just like focusing on your breathing. If I ask you, focus on your breathing, focus on the fact that you swallow your own saliva, 10 times a minute or whatever, it gets really uncomfortable. It's weird. It's the weirdest feeling, but it's like this strange thing where it's not that you're not doing it anymore. You still are breathing, but the act of bringing that background into awareness is a really defamiliarizing, sensation. And at least for me, it's coupled with a sense of a loss of presence, a loss of actually being the one who's embedded in the situation. Focus on your breathing and then notice how weird you feel while you're doing it. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment. I think it's really interesting that you said for you feel like you're not a participant anymore, which is interesting because like the idea to meditate and to focus on the breath is to actually be in the moment. So I think it's really interesting that your perception of that.
Yeah, I think being in the moment in that case is more like trying to reduce the noematic content so that there's no longer the content, it's just the background. Right? I think that's what that is descriptive of. And that's why I was describing it in terms of the phenomenological reduction, where you get rid of everything that's inessential and just focus on like the bedrock experience, which is often used synonymously with like experiencing the world to its fullest or something, experiencing a sound to its fullest, trying to get rid of everything extraneous. But the opposite, this loss of presence that I'm describing, is where the noetic aspect of perception, the background situation of perception, rises to the foreground. And that's where I feel this loss of presence. And, it's really interesting because this corresponds directly with what Heidegger is talking about in the way that an artwork brings a background situation, a background world into focus. It's articulating and clarifying the background set of assumptions, the background values, the background relationships of uses and so on, that we are always immersed in our culture, in our everyday dealing with the world. But an artwork has the uncanny ability of raising that background into focus. And that's the act of revealing. That's the truth content for Heidegger of an artwork, the way that it can reveal those sorts of background relationships to the world, the relationships we have to the world, to the objects in the world, which I think is quite interesting. I think I'd like to get into the reading a little bit more deeply. I will say maybe one thing just to sum up that relationship of the noesis and noema to the way that Heidegger says that an artwork brings that background into focus, and then the fact that it brings the background into focus recontextualizes our relationship to the world, which then feeds back into the loop because now we're aware of having this relationship to the world, and then we will perhaps have a new sort of experience of that relationship, right? One of the things that he sets up in The Origin of the Artwork, which Dreyfus talks about in that article, is the difference between world and earth. Is that right? Dreyfus does. I should look. I think that he sets up the world-earth distinction in Heidegger. The world-earth distinction is also descriptive of this sort of idea of raising the material or the background situation into awareness, into consciousness. Heidegger basically, I guess I'll just give you like a, it's hard to pinpoint, like to pin Heidegger down. And this is one of the main problems that many people have with Heidegger. And it's actually one of the critiques that Adorno makes about Heidegger, which links him to fascism, is the way that Heidegger uses words. Maybe after class, I'll unpack that a little bit. But one of the things that Heidegger does is use words incredibly ambiguously at times. And so it gets very, very difficult. Well, he uses words ambiguously, and he also constructs fictional etymologies of words. And he also creates neologisms. He like uses a word and strips it of its actual meaning, and then inserts a new meaning and a new etymology, which he says is more primordial. Something perhaps a little bit unseemly about this focus on the primordial is somehow true. Its relationship to romanticism and certain Nazi ideas like blood and earth and this sort of thing, and like the primordial truth of the people or something like that. But this is all a very long-winded way to say that it's hard to pinpoint exactly what world and earth mean. But I'll basically just describe it like this: Earth is something like the background situation. The materiality of an artwork is the earth aspect of it. We might even think of it as the of a perception. Remember, I was distinguishing between perceiving something, having consciousness of something versus having consciousness of something as something else, as being valued or something like that. The earth is basically like the object, the objective content of an artwork that is perhaps separate, or at least not completely exhausted by the meanings or the uses that humans make of the object. One way of thinking about this is, a piece of wood has all sorts of possible relationships to us. We could have all sorts of relationships to a piece of wood, right? And most of the time, or a hammer, let's say a hammer is even a better example. People use hammers all the time, right? Most of the time, our relationship to the hammer is going to be pretty utilitarian, right? We just use it to complete projects of various types, right? And in fact, we're usually not even that aware of the hammer when we're really, focused on hammering a nail or something like that. And so there's an objective aspect to the hammer that is separate from the uses that we make of it. Because, if the entirety of a hammer, if like the fullness and the essence of hammer were completely exhausted in the act of hammering, then you would never have a situation where a hammer could break. Why is that? Anybody? What happens when a hammer breaks? If a hammer's essence, or if the plenitude of a hammer were exhausted in the uses that we make of it, you would never have a situation where a hammer breaks. What happens when a hammer breaks relative to the way that we use it?
You get a disconnect between what it now is and what we think its use is supposed to be. Like if it can't perform the function of being a hammer, it's no longer a hammer. Like
yeah,
you can't have
right.
A broken hammer because it's not
right.
Once it's broken.
Well, we would say you can't have a hammer, but we still have a material object, right? And the fact that it can break seems to suggest that there's more potential in the hammer than the uses that we make of it. We think of breaking as a problem because it gets in the way of our making use of the object. But you can always think of any problem. Alternatively, you can articulate it positively. There's some other aspect in the hammer that is not exhausted by the use that we make of the hammer as a hammer. Because the fact that it breaks, positively articulated, is that there's a certain fragility to it, or there's a certain, some other aspect of the hammer that resists the way that we use it. And that's the earth aspect of a work of art. The fact that the objects in the world as we encounter them are not exhausted by the ways we encounter them, that are not exhausted by the ways we make use of them or the meanings we give them. And what world does is it clarifies to us certain aspects of how we use the objects in the world and how we encounter the objects in the world, the meanings we place on them, the values we associate with them, and so on. But what's really interesting is that if the earth aspect, the material aspect, or the thingly nature of the artwork is not exhausted in the way that an artwork functions in a society, and it's not exhausted by that, then it means that there's more potential in the artwork than whatever a given society makes of the artwork, right? That the Greeks thought a temple had a certain meaning and a certain use and a certain value and so on. But we moderns, when we encounter the temple, it has a different meaning and a different use and a different value for us. It's an object of aesthetic contemplation, or it's of historical interest, or maybe it's an admonition. The fact that it's a ruin, it's a ruined polis, this sort of thing. These all have different meanings to us than the temple originally had to the Greeks, but it's still, in some sense, the same material object. It may have changed a little bit in the centuries, in the weather and so on. But the fact is that a work of art, because the earth aspect of the work of art, the background situation, the true, complete, objective, thingly nature of a work of art is not exhausted by the uses we make of it. It means that any work of art can then be reconstituted in another world. What I mean by that is something really simple that we experience all the time: the fact that we still listen to Beethoven, right? There's something about Beethoven, a Beethoven symphony, or whatever, it doesn't matter, anything, really. Anything that existed at a time and was important for certain people and yet still maintains a certain importance for us. It's not the same importance. It's not the same meaning. It's not the same value or anything like that. The value has changed in as much as it has revealed a different world to us. So that now when we listen to a Beethoven symphony, what do we think about? Maybe we think about the idea that it is an example of perfection or something like that, or whatever. It doesn't matter. I mean, maybe we don't think it's an example of perfection, but I bet a lot of people think of it that way. That's why a lot of people, or maybe they think of it as a status symbol, or maybe they think of it as any number of ways that people describe the reason that they go and listen to a Beethoven symphony. To the extent that the modern contemporary reasons that people give are different from perhaps the original it's not even accurate to talk about the original values or the original uses as original in the sense of more true or more authentic. They're just different. But the fact that a Beethoven symphony has this aspect to it, or a work of art, it doesn't matter. Any object that we can find beautiful, that we can find that it somehow speaks to us in a certain way. The fact that it speaks to different ages and different people, different cultures, different societies in different ways, despite the fact that on some level, materially, it's the same object, is a way of unpacking the fact that the earth aspect of the object, the artwork, is not exhausted by the various worlds that it reveals to us, right? This is one of the ideas that he's getting to, which I think is kind of interesting. I mean, what that means is that the background situation is not universal. Different cultures have different background situations that are then revealed in the various worlds that are shown to us through things like artworks or this sort of thing. Let's see, did I want to talk about Dasein? Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, it's pretty much impossible to spend, an hour just unpacking all of the ideas in a work like Being in Time in its fullness. But I will say just a couple things about, if you look at the bottom of the page, this the thing about Being in Time, there are basically three aspects to Being in Time that are interesting and influential for a variety of different movements. But I think for aesthetics, Heidegger's tool analysis of being, this idea of the focus on the background situation is probably the most important. It's this idea that we're normally engaged in a very competent way of interacting with the world. And it's only when we encounter a rupture or a break, like when the hammer breaks, then we suddenly see it as a broken hammer, when before we didn't even pay attention to it at all. It was just totally absorbed or exhausted. We thought it was exhausted in the act of hammering. There's something about the rupture in experience, this encounter with something that doesn't fit in the smooth functioning of the background conditions, that is really useful for a work of art. It's this moment where we become aware in the fact that the hammer broke of the fact that we have a certain value, a way of evaluating hammers as being good or bad or this sort of thing, that we normally treat hammers as just utilitarian objects. When the hammer breaks, suddenly it comes to consciousness. And we can treat it in all sorts of different ways. We can treat it as a problem to be solved, or we could treat it as the object of a sort of, maybe we, from the fact that a hammer breaks under certain conditions, we then develop a theory of hammers, or some sort of physical theory of hardness or this sort of thing. But then we can also experience the broken hammer aesthetically, because it's been ruptured out of the normal, familiar, sort of transparent or invisible background world of uses that we normally make of it. And this aspect of rupture, of roughening the background conditions so that they don't operate smoothly anymore, is a really important aspect to how an artwork can then function as an artwork, by making us aware of all the things we take for granted in the world and showing them to us in a new sort of illuminated light or something like that. That's basically the idea in Heidegger's aesthetics. And I think it's sort of interesting, this idea, because if you think about like musical notation, right? Musical notation is a rationalized system that very often, at least at the undergrad level, is taught as a means of maximizing the efficiency of communication of an idea, right? I mean, around here, we don't necessarily treat, the composers here don't necessarily treat notation that way, because we're interested in roughening the communicative paradigm and throwing wrenches into the system and this sort of thing. But when you learn the basics of notation, what you're learning is a way to efficiently communicate a certain set of ideas, right? And there's this aspect of notation, which is very utilitarian. It's all about efficiency, efficiently communicating something. But if one of the central aspects of aesthetic experience is this rupture in the smooth functioning of the background, what that means is a roughening in the paradigm of effectiveness, of utility. And so this will lead to a situation where if we want our notation to be aesthetic, then we should come to it from the point of view of roughening it, trying to, in some sense, counteract the paradigm of efficiency, of efficient communication, or this sort of thing. That there's this act of roughening, of breaking the smooth operating surface, or the background, perhaps, is a better way of describing it. Trying to throw wrenches into things is the sort of shocking encounter where the world doesn't seem familiar anymore. It's a sort of thing where you suddenly become aware of the fact that you're in the world, experiencing the world in a certain way, evaluating the world in a certain way. And your worldview may be illuminated in a certain way, but it might also be really disturbing if it's shown up to you in a defamiliarizing way. And so, it's interesting, the relationship of utility, or of the efficiency paradigm of, say, technology, or of communication paradigms, this sort of thing, standing in the way of the sort of world revealing aspect of a work of art. And that brings us into the article on technology. But I said that we had two winners of the raffle, as Luis and Ryan. So given this introduction to phenomenology and the readings that you've done, are there any comments that you would like to bring into the discussion?
Sure. There's what I was interested in that, and what I think I would add to what we're talking about was the idea that what we were just talking about, the utilitarian approach to technology, that it's like kind of a human activity that serves humans in a sense, and that it's something that needs to be mastered. So this whole idea of mastery, which is definitely present in music, especially modern music, like you get a master's degree, there's people that are masters in their performance fields. So I thought that was, I mean, he didn't make that connection, but that's kind of, for some reason, the first thing I thought about. That's kind of, and it kind of removes you from that experience. It kind of excludes people from participating, or you from seeing that kind of pure experience when you're focusing at just mastering the pure skill rather than kind of getting to the experience itself.
Anybody want to respond to that? Yeah, well, I think, oh, go ahead, Luis. Yeah.
I was trying to find it in my notes, but I remember that Heidegger also connects this as like being part of like our dilemma with technology as well, that this mastery has kind of like a twofold kind of way of unfolding. Like we can either like be self-destructive in it, or we can reflect on it and make a better like choice about how we have our interaction with, like, what does he call it, like inframing, and how we kind of like apply it to our relationship with technology.
Yeah, let's explore that a little bit. You said the self-destructive aspect of it. In what ways would it be self-destructive?
So one of the ways that so it was difficult to read this article, but I think one of the ways that I kind of digested it is that one of the ways that inframing can be dangerous is that it kind of takes us away from anything revealing itself or revealing any object's truth. So because inframing is kind of like this way that we naturally collect things and sort them naturally, it's almost like, and it almost seems like it almost goes back to like the whole concept of style. Like we automatically kind of create these styles for everything, even when we don't realize it. I think in the other text, the way that scientists kind of have like universal truths to paradigms or exemplars without even having to discuss, given a set of data, oh yes, I see the pattern is this, even though I have not conveyed to you what the pattern is. And so while that may seem enlightening on one level, we're also kind of removing ourselves from what could be a possible revealing because we've gone ahead and placed things in these automatic categories that we have kind of self-imposed.
Well, I'm sorry, the last sentence got cut off. What did you say?
Oh God, what was the last thing you heard? I have no idea.
You were talking about Kuhn and the idea of scientific paradigms and the way that that's related to this idea of inframing, that a paradigm is basically a way of gathering together various observations, various practices in a organized, meaning-granting paradigm or frame or something like that.
Yeah, so the way I kind of took it back to Heidegger was that because we do this, it kind of like removes us from trying to find truth, which at least have objects reveal the truth to us, because technology sort of distances ourselves from that.
Right. One of the things he says about inframing is basically, and this is, even though Heidegger is constantly talking about the essence of technology, or in other articles he talks about the essence of truth or the essence of art, he doesn't mean essence in a Platonic sense. He doesn't mean like the perfect form of technology or something like that. When Plato talks about essences, he's talking about a timeless rule by which we can gather together all of the various instances of, say, justice or love or tables or whatever, and all subsume them under a general category, things we call tables, or actions of justice, or these sorts of things. A definition is involved in this concept of essence, but it takes essence to be the sort of fixed point, this fixed rule that gathers things together. That's why he's talking about the gathering together of framing. And the way that Heidegger uses the word essence is really interesting. And the pun is only possible in German. But what he does is turn essence into a verb, because the noun for essence in German is Wesen, but Wesen originally was a verb. And Wesen is this thing that it's only available to modern German as a past participle. When you say it was, you say es ist gewesen. But Wesen has this sense of coming into being, because if being is a verb instead of a fixed point, if being is developing and changing, it's very interesting. The idea that the essence of a thing is this process of revealing, right? It's not a fixed point, it's not a fixed rule, it is an activity. It's a sort of way of engaging with, say, technology, with things like truth. So when we talk about the essence of technology, the question is really something like, how do we, perhaps even unreflectively, engage with technology? And how does technology shape the way that we engage with it? It's not just that we human beings have certain ends in mind and want to find the most efficient way to achieve those ends. And so we develop technologies in order to efficiently achieve our ends. Technology itself, especially modern, and even I think today in the digital world, it's even more extreme. Technology sets upon us. Technology changes the things that we want. Right. And so in using technology, it's not just that technology is a means for us to reach our ends. Technology actually influences us and changes the sorts of things we think we want. It changes the way we think about the world. It changes the frame so that the tool actually is not just an instrument to achieve an end. It actually, in some sense, becomes its own end, where it at least at the very least, makes us see the world in a particular way. I mean, there's a really kind of trite adage, every problem looks like a nail to someone with a hammer, right? You know that adage. Every problem looks like a nail to someone with a hammer. What that is describing is the same sort of thing, wherein the hammer, which originally might have been thought of as just a means to an end, actually frames the way we see the world. In a sense, it's sort of like the Soviet joke or something. It's like a Soviet joke. It's like in Soviet Russia, man is means of technology or something like that, right? It's like we think of technology as a means, but actually we become the means of technology in the way that it shapes the way we see the world. And it's really interesting too, that adage to every problem looks like a nail to someone with a hammer already presupposes that we see the world in terms of problems to be solved, right? Instead of, think about a leaky roof. There are all sorts of, why does it appear to us as a leaky roof instead of all sorts of other things we could see it or experience it as? You might experience it, let's just say stupidly, experience it aesthetically or something. There is a way, there are all sorts of different ways, possibilities that we have in the way that we experience the world, in the way that we encounter the world such that we allow it to be revealed to us in a different way. And what he's basically saying is that technology makes us treat everything in the world in terms of resources. We come to see the world in terms of resources to be exploited, including our own lives, so that we think about why you're in college. Think about the way you're using your time. Isn't it that the way you're using your time is to maximize your activity as a resource? Maybe not because you're studying music. I think if I were talking to a bunch of MBA majors, that would be a more salient point. But this idea that the way that technology has become the main paradigm for seeing the world makes us see the world in terms of a problem to be solved through technology or as a resource to be extracted by the application of technology. But I will say he doesn't think that that's the true essence or the true potential of technology. Does anybody remember what he says at the very end? Well, who cares what Heidegger says? Just think for yourself. How else might you use technology? How else might you encounter technology such that it is not the sort of thing that you treat as an instrument, as a tool, as a means to an end, such that it is not the sort of thing that makes you see the entire world as resources to be extracted? How else might you encounter or develop a relationship with technology? Take your eyes off the article. What are other ways of encountering technology? You guys are all.
Example, you could approach it aesthetically. I can't think of any other ways off the top of my head, but like in a similar vein, it doesn't necessarily have to be a resource. Right. It's a way what we perceive it to be.
Let's develop that idea a little bit. What would it mean to engage technology aesthetically? There are at least two really fruitful ways of tracing that path.
Well, Darren said it in the chat, but thinking about technology in the same way that Heidegger describes art is as a mode of revealing would be an aesthetic.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that maybe one way to think about technology is not as a means to the end of extracting resources and stockpiling resources and that sort of thing, but as a way of encountering the world through new perspectives, through new viewpoints, such that we come to see the world not in terms of problems to be solved, but in terms of wonder, of the sort of awe of being in the world, of being the sort of being that is conscious and aware of being in the world, and understanding that that awareness of the world is really a very improbable gift. I mean, think about how improbable and amazing it is that we are aware of our own experiences and that we can adjust our interpretation of our experiences, adjust our, our effective response to our experiences. There's something really, really remarkable about that. So this way that technology can illuminate different worlds, understood as different modes of valuing the world, different modes. It can reveal the world as a different set of objects than we normally experience, so that instead of experiencing, say, a loudspeaker that's malfunctioning as a problem, maybe you commit yourself to the project of becoming a glitch DJ or something, right? Or whatever. There are all sorts of ways of sort of reifying and sort of commodifying different approaches to art or whatever. But the idea that, I think really deep down, even beneath the idea of treating a problem as not a problem, given a different set of values or different set of perspectives, you could just think about it in the way that you use noise. You encounter noise in a piece of music. I mean, usually noise, if you look up the OED definition of noise, I'm sure it's going to say something about how it's a problem or how it's like a sort of resistance or a sort of breakdown in functioning that even if the dictionary definition is not value laden, will be associated with certain values of badness, of problemness. But that's not the only way that we have to encounter things like noise. Things like discrepancies in a smoothly functioning system. We're also able to experience these things as sources of wonder, of engagement with the materiality of the world, but the materiality now reflected back to us, illuminated in this light such that it's not a problem anymore, but rather a source of wonder or of, I suppose, enjoyment, but where joy is the operative feature. We usually think of enjoyment as a sort of consumerist pleasure-seeking activity or something. But if you think about joy as just that standing in awe, in speechless awe at the improbable wonder of existence, I think that's what joy actually is. There are commodified versions of joy, but joy is really that experience of how improbable it is that anything exists at all, let alone something like human consciousness and human experience, and to treat experience as this sort of mysterious but deeply rich and fulfilling aspect of the world. This is all something that is potentially available to us through technology, in the way that technology will recontextualize the world, will in fact create a new world, a new set of perspectives and a new set of values and this sort of thing. So that technology is no longer understood in terms of use or correctness or this sort of thing, or precision of sort of mechanical or efficiency-oriented order, but rather that technology can be the sort of thing that reveals a new relationship to the world.
Yeah, what comes to mind to bring that into like a modern context is the virtual reality, developments in virtual reality, and I guess one could argue that it is still a tool, especially in terms of like VR gaming things. Like that's a tool to relax or to have fun, but at the same time, in many other ways, it's like providing a way to recontextualize your experience. By providing the opportunity to experience things you normally be able to in real life.
I mean, one of the things about virtual reality as a sort of commodified art product that always bothers me is that it doesn't put enough importance on this idea of roughening the background, right? It's all about immersion, making it, verisimilitude is the ideal, to make it as real as possible, or even more real than reality or something like that. But this idea of, getting lost in the virtual world seems to preclude the idea that the virtual world would then throw a wrench in that smooth background functioning, such that we become aware of a new perspective, or such that the sort of unconscious dealing with the world that we're normally engaged in becomes illuminated. And that's the real problem I have with the sort of version of VR and immersion that we have right now. But there are other ways.
That's not how it's imagined in like fiction. I feel like the way people imagined VR before it became a commodity was full of wrenches.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think that it's possible to have a VR environment that does roughen the background. It's just that for whatever reason, that doesn't seem commercially viable, and so people don't want to pursue that. Because everybody is so caught up in the sort of naturalism paradigm of the idea that if you create a virtual world, and then the virtual world throws a wrench in the immersion, in the presencing or whatever, that the virtual world has somehow failed. There's been some failure in the system because you're sort of shocked out of your smooth interaction or smooth integration or immersion in the system. And it could be that, I don't know, I haven't seen that many VR pieces. There was a installation by Laurie Anderson or something that I saw that was terrible, that was completely about integration of viewers in a virtual world, but it wasn't really about reflection or weirdness or discomfort or this sort of thing that might illuminate the active experience in the world and being in the world. But it's certainly possible to do that. That's one of the, when we talk about essence as a verb, as Wesen, essencein is probably a better translation for what Heidegger's getting at here. This is what he's describing, the fact that technology, the essence of technology is not something that is mind independent. The essence of technology is the constantly changing relationship that human beings and human cultures and societies can have to something like technology. And so it's certainly possible. It's on the horizon of possibility that we could have this sort of relationship to technology. It's just that because of the way the world is set up, such that we see the interests of capital and of industrial production as being the normal way things are and just have to be, as just sort of being natural. We tend to see the world as just set up that way from the get-go. But the world doesn't have to be set up that way. It could be set up in a wide variety of other ways, including ways that maybe are more fulfilling to what it actually is to be a full human experience in the world as fully as possible, something like that. Yeah.
I had a quick question kind of based off that last point you're making, and kind of going back to his, I guess, like critique of technology, turning everything into a way of finding the natural world as just a resource. Does Adorno, or like, is there, when I was reading the technology article, I kept kind of almost waiting. I just realized I was waiting for like a critique of capital in that. But it seems like
there isn't.
It felt kind of weird.
Well, there sort of is. I mean, but it's not capitalism.
It's supply chain,
like an acknowledgement.
It's right. It's modernity, really, that Heidegger's complaining about. It's not capitalism as, say, a political, as being the sort of organizational system that has certain, I suppose, socially oppressive elements to it. It seems like he's really just mad at the modernized, mechanized, I suppose, information data-driven world, right? The quantified world, the idea that the only thing that is true that can actually, the only sort of information or knowledge that is often taken to be true is quantified knowledge that you can quantify and that you can communicate to other people that can then be reproduced in a variety of ways. This is what he doesn't like, but there's nothing specific about capitalism. And I think that it's because Heidegger wants to be apolitical or something, but then there are all sorts of problems with that stance because it's sort of a truism, but no one can ever really be apolitical because being apolitical is already a political stance. It's already to take a stand on the world as it is. Yeah, I think that Adorno, one of the main criticisms that he has of Heidegger, well, there are all sorts of criticisms. Maybe when we talk about Adorno in 2 weeks, I'll flesh some of those out a little bit. But one of them is that Heidegger's idea of authentic human relating to the world, what he calls authenticity, which I talked about it just now in very florid terms of like joy and this sort of thing. But Adorno thinks that Heidegger is trying to posit an ahistorical subject. Is trying to posit this sort of sense of identity of true human being in the world that is separate from his cultural history, is separate from society, is separate from politics. The reason I didn't really talk about this aspect of situatedness in Heidegger, but one of the central ideas in Heidegger is that there are all sorts of things about our lives that we don't choose. The family we're born into, the language we speak, the historical period we're born in, and so on. But what we can do is adjust our relationship to that situation and try to come into maybe a new sort of experiential relationship to our situation. But the problem with that is that it seems to suggest this idea that there is this timeless, authentic way of being a human subject in the world that's independent of whatever historical era you're in. Because if he's saying that we just happen to be born in a specific time, but we have this authentic human essence or essencing or something like that, what he's saying is that there's a necessary separation between culture, society, history, and human subjectivity. And this is a big problem for Adorno because basically what he says is Heidegger's project of trying to be authentic in the world basically amounts to focusing on some, kind of spurious idea of being like the true individual, being a true individual, becoming who you really are, that is not at all associated with actually trying to change the situation, right? It's just trying to make yourself amenable to the situation. Let me put this in maybe even clearer terms than that. You all know what Stoicism is? Are you familiar with Stoicism? Anybody who needs to leave, it's fine. I said I'll have an office hour after class, so if you need to leave, it's fine. But Stoicism is basically, it's an ancient philosophy and way of life. But Shakespeare's Julius Caesar? Brutus is a Stoic in that. Stoicism is basically a philosophy that holds the following. Fate gives us all sorts of things that we can't change, that we have no power over. The only thing that we do have direct power over is the way that we relate to what fate gives us. So, you may have been born poor and you have no control over that, but what you do have control over is the fact that you don't have to think of being poor as a burden or something like that, right? This is basically a Stoic idea. And Heidegger's ethic is basically just a modernized Stoicism, that we're born into a situation that is not of our choosing, that is completely contingent. The fact that we're finite, we will die at a certain point. The fact that we were born in a certain period or place or whatever, none of that is really within our power to change. The only thing we can change is our feelings about that situation, to try to live authentically in that situation. And that for Adorno is really problematic because then all of the focus is on this spurious idea of identity and individualism without any effort to change the situation, to actually fight for dismantling oppression and hegemony and this sort of thing. So to answer your question about capitalism, yeah, it's not surprising that Heidegger doesn't have anything to say about capitalism because he seems very sort of insular in his way of dealing with the world, perhaps. Anyway, am I coming through okay? Some of you are frozen. Oh, maybe you're not frozen. Oh, I see. Luis was just deep in thought and wasn't moving. So yeah. Well, I told Shane I'd have an office hour now, so we can continue this discussion, or if you have other questions. I think Shane had some questions about Nietzsche. But if there are any other questions about Heidegger, I mean, we've hardly exhausted. Later, Jeff. Okay.
Oh, hey, sorry. Can you see me or hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, actually, I emailed you that, and then I started the essay on art. That is it, Dreyfus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he kind of almost answered some of the questions I had on Nietzsche. That when we talked about paradigms. I guess last class when we were talking about Nietzsche and truth and kind of like the willingness to deceive ourselves. Yeah. I thought that I had was like, is Nietzsche kind of saying that like through engaging in this willful deception, we like reinforce the illusion that we kind of, I guess I'm trying to understand if I'm on the right path here.
Sorry, I was kind of reading a chat comment as you're asking that. Can you ask that again?
Yeah. So in reading last week's Nietzsche, I was wondering if he was getting at that like engaging in willful deception, or maybe Plato's getting at this in the Republic, that like the willful deception of poetry or whatever serves a function of like reinforcing our ideas of truth. Like that's like the utility of them. And I guess like, is that the critique of poetry, or like that like when we and I guess like in catharsis as well, like that like by engaging in this kind of willful deception, like we come away feeling stronger that we know that the illusion we forgot is an illusion isn't an illusion, that it is truth.
And you're asking, is poetry acting to reinforce that?
Yeah, I guess. And is that like a claim that Nietzsche is making, or am I just kind of reading into that?
Well, maybe to a certain extent. I think that, really what it sounds like you're asking, it has something to do with like a question of propaganda versus art or something like that. If you think of propaganda as merely the sort of thing that will reinforce a viewpoint instead of questioning and roughening a situation to bring about new perspectives, new ways of looking at the world, then that's one of the potential dangers of art. I think that Plato would say that Homeric epics, the poetry that was very influential in the educational system in Athens, one of the problems is that it reinforced certain values that Plato thought were bad values. Like, if you look at the Homeric heroes, in the Iliad or the Odyssey, none of them behave in a way that we would describe as ethical. They all behave in a way that shows that what they think of the good is more or less identical with just being really good at something.
Yeah.
Right. For instance, like being really strong, and if you're so strong that you can kill an entire civilization and reap all their resources, or if you're so cunning that you can deceive people and get the better of them, then that's virtue. That's what's good. And Plato's problem is that that sort of art, presented unreflectively without any sort of challenge or questioning, is really just acting as propaganda to reinforce a certain set of values. And I think that there's a really important question. If we look at Heidegger, then what Heidegger seems to be suggesting is that bad art reveals our world to us, but it doesn't push our world in any direction. It doesn't challenge the way that we experience the world. It just sort of restates our experience of the world, or confirms our experience of the world, confirms the way we value the world, this sort of thing. And that to the extent that a work of art as a sort of material sort of thing, what he calls the earth aspect of art, is not exhausted in one particular world, one particular viewpoint or set of values or whatever, that in artwork can also exist in a different paradigm and a different set of values or resonances or meanings or this sort of thing, and still be valid, still be the same artwork in some sense, but understood differently. That means that a good artwork will have the capacity to show us how we view the world, show us how we experience and value the world, but also at the same time make it strange, make that experience that we have of the world, the reflection of it back to us, strange in such a way that we are moved to some other viewpoint, some other world, right? So that, like, for instance, when he talks about the way that the truth, the aletheia, or the revealing of the artwork sets itself into the materiality, into the stone or into the wood or whatever of the artwork in such a way that it becomes illuminated. One of the ways that it changes our experience of the world, it reflects back to us the same object in a sense, but it, in the case of the shoes by Van Gogh, right, the peasant shoes or whatever, it reflects back to us the peasant shoes. We still see it as the peasant shoes, and we can still see the painting as paint on a canvas. But then at the same time, that materiality is illuminated in a different world, such that we see, for instance, the darkness, the depths of the shoes as a sort of mystery, or as a sort of foreboding element or something like that. We see the materiality of the canvas not just as some object in the world that we might ignore or that we might use to effectively meet our material interests, but we actually treat it as a beautiful sort of thing that elicits a sort of, how should I say, weird awe or wonder, or just like sort of head scratching. Like if you see a Jackson Pollock canvas or something, it's like, you don't really, if you just treat it as a material object, then you just treat it as a bunch of random splotches of paint on a canvas. But if you treat it as anything more than that, then what it's doing is taking the fact that it's that material object, but then also revealing it in some world. But the world is revealing to us our relationship to the work as a physical object, such that it suggests other directions, other pathways for interpreting the meaning and the value of the work of art. And that's what a good work of art would do. And that's what sets it apart from propaganda, because what propaganda does is simply confirm I would say another thing that propaganda does, which is different from art in this understanding, is it doesn't point in any other direction. And it may not just be that it confirms a worldview. Very often it does, in the way that, like, some stupid pop song confirms certain values that we have about wealth as power and as status, and the idea of something being like easy to understand as being valuable because people will buy it, and this sort of thing. That in some sense acts as propaganda because it might confirm a certain way of seeing the world. But another way that art can act as propaganda is to reveal a different way of seeing the world in such a way that it doesn't suggest any alternatives to the world that it presents. So, like, for instance, maybe you're some Amish person or something and you've never listened to pop music or whatever. I'm giving pop music a bad rap, but I'm just using a hypothetical example. You're some Amish person and you've never experienced pop music, and then you go to some club on your Ringsprunge, if you know what that is. Amish people get a year to encounter secular life. And so let's say you get really into some dance pop song or something. I would say that to the extent that you really get into it, that you're probably engaging it in a way that is world revealing. I think that really it's more a matter of the passive sort of consumption of art, of music, or movies or whatever that is problematic, where it's like, maybe even if you didn't have the viewpoint to begin with, there's something so immediately, fun or enjoyable or pleasing about the work of art that it sort of, in quotation marks, forces a perspective, forces a way of valuing the world on you that maybe you didn't have before. And the propaganda aspect there is not so much about confirming the values you already had, because it's suggesting a different way of experiencing the world in terms of fun, in terms of enjoyment, in terms of wealth, or whatever. Wealth is power. But to the extent that a work of art or a pop song or something like that functions as propaganda, it doesn't really suggest any other ways, any other worlds, or perspectival paradigms to encounter the work with.
I guess I have a question, like kind of going back to the Nietzsche, like before, like, because he uses an example of dreaming, and one thing I'm wondering is, like, even before you even encounter the art, you're kind of aware that you are encountering, like in for example, poetry, like you're aware that you're encountering something outside of a true story almost.
You mean when you dream?
Maybe not in this example, but yeah, I guess like I'm kind of wondering about like the utility of art. I don't know if I'm using the word utility right, but like regardless of the context of what was that, sorry?
Oh, I just said, what do you mean by utility?
I guess like the function of it. So like with propaganda, we're kind of talking about the quality of the art, and I'm wondering like if
not necessarily
before the movie.
See, here's you can have incredibly well done propaganda.
Yeah, I guess.
So it's strictly speaking
about subject matter is what I'm talking about. Where like like you can sit down in the theater and regardless of what you're about to see, there's like a line in the sand of like, now I am kind of about to reflect on like something, and I might encounter something that reconfigures my world. But like regardless of, I guess, like the subject matter that I'm about to, I'm willingly like coming up against something that I know is a depiction, I guess. So like, and in Nietzsche's words, like a willing deception. I don't know if this is right. Like, so I guess I'm just saying, like, this kind of like, how does this affect our perception of being, and that it like reinforces that, like, the tactile. Kind of getting lost here, I guess, but like, how does it like reinforce our idea of understanding truth and like what is? Does that make sense? Like,
not exactly. So just start talking again, and I'll see if I can latch on to what you're saying. Because the thing about the tactile quality of an experience or of an artwork or something seemed interesting to me.
Yeah, I guess experience is a good word for it. Of like, I know I'm about to engage in an experience that is in some way outside of myself, so that like I can then contextualize the experiences that I have myself as being true and real. Like, so like a way of that, like any kind of art, just by engaging in it, you are reinforcing that you have an understanding of, I guess, a subjective view of the world or something.
It's interesting when you talk. Can you give like an example of what you mean by like the tactile or the, I guess, I don't know, maybe like the material?
Yeah. Like, I mean, we talk about like getting lost in art a lot, but I think that like you still have that background information that you are not in the movie, you're in your chair kind of. So it's just like, so like outside of like, so it's just like by watching the movie, you're aware that you exist in this, like you exist in the world almost.
Yeah, but that seems probably only to happen in those moments that something, it's a really fine line to tread, right? Because, how do you get lost in or engrossed in a movie so that you stop noticing that you're sitting there watching the movie and evaluating it. And it's not just that the movie gives you things that you expect to happen, because if that is the case, then you just get bored, and you then do become aware that you're sitting there and not having a good time because everything's so predictable. What the movie or piece of music that wants to engross you has to do is show you something that you know already but don't realize you know, that you expect to happen but don't realize you expect, right? This is something that Schoenberg talks about, the way that when you set up a piece of music, he seems to really value the idea of someone getting absorbed and lost in an artwork or a musical experience, but he says that really what a composer is trying to do is give the listener what they expect without them realizing they're expecting it, which means that there has to be a certain logic to the connection of events in the storyline or in the what happens in the piece of music. There has to be a sort of like reasonable connection from event 1 to event 2, and that they all sort of rise to this climax that seems inevitable just given the way the events of the story are set up or something like that. But the inevitability of it needs to be presented or articulated in a way that is also shocking.
So could you say like that it's in that's like almost bringing in the marginal? So it's like you're aware, or like that, like you're aware of.
Well, yeah, possibly. What do you mean by bringing in the marginal?
So like in Heidegger's example, he talks about like kind of Jesus. He kind of focuses almost on like that eighth commandment of like, don't covet thy neighbor. And so that's like,
that's Hubert Dreyfus with that example.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But it's like that's almost like a marginal aspect of the Judeo value system. And he puts it to the forefront. So like kind of an example, I feel like we're talking almost about plot or story that like, or in music where it's just like, you're aware of like, you have to be aware of it on certain aspects, but it has to feel like it's on the margins. And then when you bring it up in a surprising way, it feels, I guess, like trying to bring up something marginal, but make it feel inevitable.
You know, the way Aristotle, this is why I gave you that Aristotle reading. We didn't have time to talk about it in a lot of depth, but this is the sort of thing that Aristotle is analyzing in the Poetics, how it is that something impossible can be accepted, but something improbable can't be accepted. Oscar Wilde has a similar statement where he says, you know, your average theater goer or reader has no problem with the impossible. They only have problems with the improbable. What's improbable is when you have a series of events that don't seem to have that sort of logical connection where one connects to the next, such that they reach some sort of climax that when you look back from the climax to the beginning, it's like, oh, that's where it was all leading to. You know, so that there's this connection in time where we experience the moment as flowing in a way that's directed through logical connection, you know, not throwing wrenches into the story, but rather sort of threading the viewer or the listener along, such that when you get to the climax, you can see everything that led up to that climax, and it seems like it had to happen that way. So that's the question of probability versus improbability. Probability is the way that there seems to be that rational connection, such that it all sort of fits together in the perfect way or something like that. Impossibility is less important because, you know, you look at Star Wars, and there's no problem that they have with showing explosions in space, even though explosions in space are impossible, right? Because there would be no fire or sound or anything like that. Or whatever the material is, can be something that is marginal, as you say, because it's impossible, or the sort of thing that is not the way the world really is in our normal experience of it. But the reason that that can be both expected and unexpected, it's unexpected because it's not something that is actually possible in the world, but it is expected through the logic of the narrative, leading up to, you know, threading each moment to the next, to this climax, and then the way the climax resolves itself and so on. And so what you're describing is this distinction that Aristotle sets up between form and content. The content can be totally, you know, magical or like absurd or whatever, as long as it can be the sort of thing that can fit into a sort of logical, cohesive, and coherent storyline or form or something like that. How did we get to that? Because you were talking about propaganda.
So yeah, like I guess I think we're talking about immersion.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. And so, you know, you're right that there's a sense in which, you know, when you're watching a movie, you're never totally immersed because you always have the possibility of stepping out and thinking, oh, I'm just, you know, watching this stupid movie. But I don't know if that's true when you're really engaged in a like a binge-worthy show or something. You know, when you're watching something where you're like totally captivated.
I'm kind of wondering if that, now that we're talking about Aristotle, if that thrill of like maybe of kind of like your background context of the world ceasing for a moment and feeling fully immersed in the thing, how that relates to catharsis, I guess, and then how that relates to willingly deceiving ourselves, to Nietzsche, kind of like if we're trying to totally lose that background conception of the world and that we are in a seat watching a screen, and if we can feel that.
No, the thing though is that you're not losing the background conception, or it's not even a conception. Conception is the wrong word because it's not conscious. It's like pre-conscious. It's that background subconscious functioning in the world that we're always doing all the time. But that doesn't fall away when you immerse yourself in like a VR environment or a movie. It gets brought up into it's brought up into the VR environment. So that the fact that you are lost just means that you're coping with a different set of background conditions, the background conditions of the virtual environment, right? So you asked about catharsis and the idea of willful deception or willful belief or something like that. I would say that, you know, what Aristotle is describing in that sense that a captivating narrative, we won't say a good narrative or a bad narrative, but just sort of narrative that like engrosses you or, you know, gets you immersed or lost in the movie or the piece of music or whatever, I'll try to use value neutral language. I was going to say it's parasitic on the way that we are immersed in backgrounds, because we don't really even pay attention to the fact that the world as we encounter it is coherent and makes sense and is in some sense predictable, right? I mean, the very fact that any activity that you do, last week I used the example of like opening your door, you know what's going to be there, right? I mean, you know that there's a door to open, you know that certain actions involve certain effects, right? This action of opening the door opens the door, and the door is this thing that is square or rectangle and is always rectangle, and when you walk through it, the world makes sense in all these ways that are predictable and intelligible and so on. That fact of intelligibility is only possible if we're already engaged in a background that is pre-reflective, right? It's like the fact that we already know how to engage in our environment, regardless of whether or not we think about what we're doing or try to come up with a theory or a conscious representation of what we're doing, we're already doing it. You know, we're already engaged in these activities. And that is, I think, if we're to take a Heideggerian look at Aristotle, what that basically means is that what Aristotle is describing as the sort of natural narrative, the feeling in a movie that's well put together, that each event kind of follows smoothly out of the last event and, you know, smoothly rises to this climax that makes sense, where it seems like everything leading up to that had to reach that climax, and then the climax somehow resolves itself, is parasitic on the fact that we are already engaged in the world in such a way that the world seems to make sense and to cohere and to be intelligible. You know, because alternatively, if the world didn't have that sort of logical structure or something like that, I mean, existence would be impossible, and certainly consciousness would be impossible. If, you know, the entire world were constantly shifting and there were no sort of stability in anything, there were no sort of smoothly functioning background conditions, then nothing would be possible. But it's also sort of interesting that, you know, when you start to make the world clear to yourself, when you start to look at what you're experiencing, not how you think about what you're experiencing, but try to like get fully into the experience of the world, what you start to notice is that actually things are changing all the time, and that no two things are exactly alike ever. You know, this is what Nietzsche's talking about with the leaves. And so it's like, well, wait a minute, you know, the world as we actually experience it when we think about our experience seems to be about difference and change. And, you know, at the same time, it seems to cohere and hang together such that we see things as existing through time or something like this. And so I think that, you know, for Aristotle, that logical structure of narrative is something that is perhaps an expression of a smoothly functioning background, you know, the sort of logical, non-conceptual way that reality seems to hang together for us, because we're able to like function in reality without thinking about it. And then the content is then a more sort of conscious level of narrative or of a piece of music. And that's where you can get this sort of tension where you both expect something to happen, but also don't know that you expect it, because on the level of content, you know, there may be events or words or, you know, actions that happen that are unexpected. And at the same time, if they logically flow out of the continuity of the narrative, then you do expect them at the same time. And then as regards what you asked about Nietzsche, what's the question exactly about Nietzsche?
I'm not,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm kind of a little bit, don't know where we're at. Like the original question that I like reached out to you about was kind of like, I guess was wondering like why Nietzsche thinks we willfully deceive ourselves.
Oh,
if it is to feel like we have mastered our conception of truth, if that's the reason, I guess.
Yeah. I would say that Nietzsche thinks that we deceive ourselves for a variety of reasons. One is to feel better about the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, that's...
You know, many of his works deal with that basic idea that the things that we call morality, like for instance, contemporary morality, which is based in Judeo-Christian morality, is actually, if you were to, you know, kind of go back through the mists of time, what you would find is that back in the day, there was a class of people that were enslaved by another class of people that had power. And the class of people that had power didn't really think about morality. What they thought about was this conflation of being good with being good at something. Right?
Yeah.
So the Homeric values, right? So like the master class or whatever is, you know, if you can enslave an entire race of people, then that's great, because it's an expression of your power, right? Yeah. And so that was the value system. And then what you have is, and also I'll say within that value system of like goodness and excellence being thought of as the same thing, that to be good, I mean, there's not even any moral sense of to be good, but to the extent that we think of to be good means just being good at, you know, enslaving people or being strong or being cunning or whatever, then to be bad just means to be weak, or to be really simplistic, or, you know, to, there's a thing in German where the German word for bad, there's a word for bad, which is schlecht, which just means, it doesn't mean evil, it just means bad in the sense of, you know, faulty, or just kind of, you know, like something that doesn't work well. Like, so like if this can have a hole in it, I say that's eine schlechte Dose, right? Because it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. But that schlecht is related to the word schlicht, which means simple or simplistic, or, you know, you can also think of it as being sort of like impoverished, right? And so in the master morality, you've got good and bad as just a simple articulation of how much power you have. And then what he says is that Judeo-Christian morals arise out of this situation where the people that are disempowered, are weak, start to look at the master class and describe everything that the master class thinks is good as not being bad, but evil. And he says it's really interesting that, he's talking in German, but it's the same in English, that good, the word good, has two opposites that mean different things. There's bad and there's evil.
Yeah.
Right. And so then he thinks that, aha, this is a moment where, because there are two different opposites to a single term, it must be the case that at some point there was a branching off of one of the opposites, right? So that bad turns into evil. And in this case, what he's saying is that evil as a moral concept only arises when you have a group of people that are disempowered. And so they say, those people that are oppressing us, that are exploiting us, that are torturing us, they're evil, because they're expressing their power for their own interests, and they're treating us as just, you know, livestock or something like that.
So does that create, does that create another version of good? So like if you have good and then evil and bad, now you have...
Yeah, right, exactly right. So that then the opposite of evil is good in a moral sense. Instead of just good at something, to be good morally, right? Which will be the opposite, which will be the people that are disempowered. If evil is the people that are just expressing their power, then the people that are being exploited and oppressed will be good, right? This is basically what he sets up. But to answer your question, and if we think of goodness, the right thing to do, ethics and just the good in general, as being either synonymous with or in the domain of the truth, right? The truth is good. To do the right thing is to act in a way that is true, like, that there's something moral about the idea of truth, not just that it describes, if I say, I'm holding a can, you could just take that sentence as an incorrect statement of fact. There's no morality about me saying I'm holding a can now. It's just incorrect. But if you think of that as a lie, then now what you've done is conflated truth with morality, right? And what he's saying is, at that moment where morality first emerges as a way of the enslaved class calling the people who have power bad or evil and we're good, and you then conflate that good with something like truth, then what you have is a situation where morality and truth are just a story that an enslaved people tell to themselves in order to feel better about their situation. Right. So that's basically the situation that he sets up, that truth is just something that we say about things we like. So this is, I think, why he thinks that there is no truth, there are only aesthetics, there's only art. Because, we have no problem of talking about art in terms of the things we like, and maybe even only as not being morally correct or, powerful in any sort of, immediately obvious sense, but just that we like them. That the things that we like, we just like. And not that there's some sort of cosmic truth to that, just that it's contingent on the sort of beings we are and the situation we find ourselves in. This is his idea. This is an idea that a lot of people have problems with. I would say that you shouldn't think of Nietzsche as, well, first of all, Nietzsche called him he called himself the Antichrist. He even has a book called The Antichrist, where he refers to himself in print as the Antichrist. He wants to completely demolish Christian values and so on. But the thing about Nietzsche is really just that he's a signpost of a direction that the culture is going in anyway. So
doesn't he also kind of,
go ahead,
this is, I guess, in his like Death of God stuff, doesn't he kind of warn about like, if you don't have something solid to come after, like if once you erode the Christian values, if you don't have something solid, doesn't he kind of warn of the danger of that though? Or
right, yes, he does. It's the sort of thing, like if you actually examine, there's an allegory in the Gay Science, which is there are a few other paraphrases of the statement God is dead, but the famous one is from the Gay Science, and the story is really interesting if you really analyze the story, because he doesn't come out and say something like, we have, through physical sciences and rational method, determined once and for all that God doesn't exist, so let's celebrate. What he does is set up a myth, a little allegory, which is really evocative and kind of melancholy and also a little bit mysterious and frightening. Do you know the allegory? Because I'll paraphrase a little bit of it.
No, I don't.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So first of all, he sets up this scene where there's like a town square or something, and there's a man walking around in broad daylight with a lit lantern. And he's going around asking people, where is God? Where is God? And they all laugh at him. It's like, you're looking for God here in the marketplace? Why don't you like go climb a tree and look up in the sky? Or why don't you go to church or whatever? And what he says is, these people don't yet realize what has happened, that God is dead and we have killed him.
Is this in the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra? Is this separate from that?
There's a similar moment in a marketplace in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or Thus Spoke Zarathustra as well. But it's slightly different allegory. But then the thing is that it's really interesting. For one thing, because the image of a man walking around with a lit lantern in the daytime is actually taken from antiquity. It's the image of Diogenes, the cynic, who walked. The cynics were these weird guys that like wore rags and were homeless and lived in barrels and wanted to completely shun, pleasures and wealth and that sort of thing.
I only know the example of the man is an animal that has two legs but no feathers, and like isn't that
right? So the Plato's trying to come up with a definition of what is a human, and it's a flightless, featherless biped. And then Diogenes comes in with a dead plucked chicken and say, "Behold, man." But he's wandering around with his lit lantern. Diogenes, what he says is, "I'm looking for an honest man," and he never finds an honest man. He's unable to find anyone that actually rises to that challenge. And it's interesting that that's the image that Nietzsche brings into the discussion about the death of God. For a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is that the people that are laughing and jeering at him, there are a couple different ways of reading that, but one of the ways to read is that they're kind of exuberant about the death of God and don't quite yet realize how completely undermining to any sense of meaning or to any sorts of stability in society or in life, not having that sort of metaphysical certainty or metaphysical truth or a metaphysical source of morality. If you get rid of all of that, then we're in a really dire situation. And so the fact that they're all laughing, the man with the lantern says, They don't yet, he says, I've come too soon. They don't yet realize what I'm saying. And then what he does is go into all the churches and sing the Te Deum, the Requiem. He sings the Requiem, the death mass for God, in the sepulchres of God. So that he calls the churches the tomb, the sepulchre of God. So there are all sorts of really kind of startling images.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Like when you say like they're laughing because they haven't quite realized what that means, I guess they kind of reminded me of, I guess, like the story that the enslaved class, where they attribute, so like when they kind of flip that like evil, and then on the other hand there's like moral good, it kind of made me think that you could draw a line in there where like moral good is like, I guess like the ability to enslave is like in a weird shadow of like evil morality, which kind of in that thinking makes me think that like there will always be an essence of like whoever is in power will always be kind of in relationship to evil in a way that like makes me think that, I guess,
it depends on who's defining the terms of good and evil.
Yeah.
If one of the images he gives in another spot is he's talking about a falcon eating little lambs, swooping down from the skies and eating little lambs, and that the falcon thinks that the lambs are good because they're good at fulfilling what the eagle wants them to do. And the lambs might see the eagle as evil, but the eagle's just doing what eagles do.
Yeah.
And one of the central ideas in Nietzsche is the question: why is it that we alone, as far as all of the life forms that we have encountered on Earth, why is it that we alone torture ourselves with these questions about morality, or what the right thing to do is, or what truth is, these sorts of things? Pretty much every other life form just does what it does, so that there's no, the whole idea of a guilty conscience is predicated on the idea that who you are is separate from what you do, right? If what you do just is who you are, then you're doing the right thing if you're just sort of authentically expressing who you are. And this is where Heidegger's ethics, to the extent that they're ethical at all, intersect with Nietzsche, that if to be authentic just means to be who you are in the most authentic way possible, to take stock of your mortality and your situation that is not of your own choosing, but to just try to be authentic, to just be the person that you are, and not develop a guilty conscience because you have some sense of a perfect identity that's separate from all the imperfect actions that you perform. Then you can see how it's related to Nietzsche. But then, of course, the problem is that means that if Hitler, if his project is something like the annihilation of an entire people or something like that, and he's doing it, if there is no sort of, if he is, to think about the Holocaust, and what is so disturbing about that, I think, is how epic and, how should I say? I want to say this in non-laudatory terms, but the fact that the Holocaust was not an easy undertaking. It's like, if you think that becoming who you are in like the most like committed way as possible is the same thing as being ethical, because you're just discovering your true essence, your true authentic being, then the Holocaust is great because it is like this massive epic undertaking. The only problem is that no sane person would call that ethical.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is the problem in the ethics of Nietzsche or in the ethics of Heidegger that is so close to the sort of, it's a non-ethics really. It's a sort of very naturalized understanding of ethics, that ethics is just the expression of an organism's power, or the collection of organisms expressing their power, their domination over others, and that sort of thing. And it's interesting with Heidegger because, sorry, go ahead. What?
Is it or their lack of power, or is it just their power? Yeah, because I'm thinking of the enslaved class, I guess, in Greek.
Well, the enslaved class situation of morality sets up I suppose, a difference between the idea of who you are and what you do. I think that there's this idea, perhaps, that the evil class is evil because they're acting in a way that is immoral. And if you think that it's possible for them, if they have free will, then they must be able to change their behavior and act ethically, namely not to express their power in an oppressive way, right? But once you do that, once you set up this idea that you can act ethically by renouncing power, or by renouncing the drive to just exert yourself as an organism in the world, that you think that you have the choice to deny that power seeking or power expressing aspect of life in the interests of some other sort of life, then there's this idea that there's this ideal way to be that is separate from how you act. Right? And so if something is evil, then it necessarily means that it's not acting in accordance with some sort of ethical identity or ethical true human nature. The true moral nature of human beings is to change their actions so that they're in alignment with the right thing to do, right? And what Heidegger and Nietzsche are both doing is trying to say, humans, and I think that they're not very convincing in this regard, because, morality is another way that an organism can be in the world, right? That it can exert its power in the world. And I think that Nietzsche actually does say something like that. He thinks that the transvaluation, the creation of morality, is really just an expression of power. It's not a physical sort of power, but it is a sort of creative power, which is perhaps more sophisticated than the brute strength force of Achilles or the Homeric heroes or whatever, the masters, right? But then that's sort of interesting that morality, if you think of morality as just another expression of power, then you don't have a way of deciding between the expression of power understood in terms of morality and the expression of power determined in terms of oppression. There's no way to decide which one is right, because they're both just expressions of power, right? Yeah, and so, but this is all related to this problem that we find ourselves in, according to Nietzsche anyway, in the death of God, that there's a architectural historian who talks about how we're in the age of optimistic atheism, or like celebratory atheism. And I think that that's what Nietzsche is describing with all the people that are laughing and kind of celebrating the death of God, that they don't quite realize
who is that
actually amounts to. What's that?
Who's that architect?
Oh, here, I'll type it in the Jonathan Meades. He has a lot of really cool BBC documentaries that you can watch that are really, really thought-provoking, but also entertaining and really well produced.
Cool.
Interesting guy. But, yeah. Yeah, it's a vexing question. But,
yeah, I don't want to keep you too much longer. There's one thing with Heidegger where, I mean, we talked about capitalism a little bit, but we don't have to get into it too much. But, and I was kind of wondering, because it's half the stuff he says feels like it feels very supportive of the idea of like historical materialism, and half the stuff feels like totally against it. And I'm excited to get into Adorno, because I actually don't know him much. I just know that he has some Marxist stuff, but.
Well, Adorno is straightforwardly also a critic of Marx. I don't think that Heidegger has much to say about Marx. Adorno both continues Marx, but then also thinks that Marx got a lot of things wrong. And so it's interesting to see that relationship. But yeah, as regards Heidegger and like a sort of Marxist critique of capital and the culture industry and industrial, mass-produced, quantified society and so on, I think that rather than thinking of that as oriented towards a sort of Marxist critique, it's more like a romantic critique of Enlightenment. Of course, Marx is another expression of the romantic critique of Enlightenment. But the idea with Heidegger is that he seems to be really kind of obsessed with this return to the primordial. Yeah. Or which there's something obviously very romantic about that. Like this getting back to like the true spirit of a people or something like that. And there's something kind of nice about that, but there's also something kind of terrifying about it, considering he was a Nazi. And it's also the sort of thing that gets co-opted. That sort of idea of this authentic individuality that is also expressed in an individual's relationship to a people and that sort of thing. It gets co-opted in capitalist culture in all sorts of different ways. I think one of the, like for instance, hipsters, I think are very much an expression of this particular understanding of authenticity in a really superficial way.
Minimalism.
Yeah, getting back to basics, getting back to what is, I think that Heidegger is not exactly a minimalist in that sense, because I think the primordial is like really rich and complex and, I think Wes Anderson or something is probably like a better example where it's like of cheesy, crappy, commodified authenticity, where it's not minimalist, right? His style is not minimalist, but it's this sort of fake authenticity that, but I also think that, a lot has been written. Go ahead. Why don't you follow up on that? Because I want to move in a different direction.
Well, just I was thinking of minimalism in terms not of like necessarily like the music history or art history, but like the kind of commodified living of like the way that capitalism kind of like sells you minimalism, and like through like an expensive, like there are like nowadays there are like companies that there's one called Everlane where they sell you like uniforms, but they're for a $400 shirt, and it's like the idea that you can just like kind of have your uniform in your closet, but it's like extremely expensive. And
wait, are they real uniforms that people wear for jobs, or are they like clothes that look
like a nice button-up shirt? But the idea is that it's like so neutral that you can kind of wear it every day.
Yeah.
And so
right.
That was
right. Yeah. I mean, in minimalism, like the Marie Kondoification of life, there's a kind of, really what it is conspicuous consumption, because it's a way of showing that you don't need everything that poor people actually need just to get, to work on time, So it's like a conspicuous lack of consumption, but it's the same basic problem. But with authenticity, what I was going to talk about is the way that, there's a lot of literature now where people write about how Heidegger's idea of authenticity, this sort of Stoic ideal of authenticity, of like being your true self and not worrying about changing the world because fate gives you what it gives you. And, of course, for Heidegger, that's really problematic because considering that he lived and flourished in an immoral society, Nazi Germany, it's really problematic to have this concept of authenticity that's not associated with fighting for like a just and fair and humane ethical society. But there's an argument now about the way that this conception of authenticity then maybe even surprisingly gets co-opted in what, for lack of a better term, people describe as identity politics, or neoliberalism, understood as being socially liberal but economically conservative. The idea being that a neoliberal conception of identity is about expressing both your own authentic identity, but then also the authentic identity of a group. But it does so in such a way that it fits into the capitalist system in a really efficient and exhaustive way, so that people think about social justice and equality now only in terms of how little they're marginalized from the structures of capitalist society. In other words, it's like nobody really cares that much about breaking down the inequality, economic inequality, or all of the various sorts of exploitation and oppression of capitalism. Everybody just wants to fit into the capitalist system now, and they want their identity to be recognized in the capitalist system. But they don't want
a seat at the table.
affect the capitalist system. What's that?
I think a term I heard for that is like a seat at the table.
Oh, seat at the table. Yeah, exactly right. So that everybody wants to keep the table. They don't want to question how exploitative and oppressive the capitalist system is. They just want to eat their equal share at the table.
Or like representation at the table, no matter how many are left behind of that group.
Yeah, exactly right, exactly. So one superhero movie that has a black protagonist is like somehow this step towards equality. So it's like no, it's just it's a way of capturing the I suppose the way that the margins and minorities within a given situation actually act to push against the values of the situation. The idea that I think this is really obvious in the way that like gay culture sort of solidified around the question of gay marriage, right? I mean, it's weird because one of the most powerful aspects of gay agitation or gay protests and that sort of thing in the Stonewall era was precisely that they were viewed as perverse, but perverse only means that it pushes against, right? It's something that pushes against, that criticizes the dominant value system, the dominant viewpoint. But then in the case of gay marriage, you have a situation where there's this idea that they just want to have the equal share of the pie, the material resources that capitalism gives to married couples or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's something I think just about that. Certainly we don't want to exclude people, but then at the same time it loses that sort of questioning capacity. That if the only interest is to fit into the system instead of to like radically question the system, then you have this problem where the authentic, this sort of superficial understanding of an authentic way of being who you are and expressing the way that you want to be in the world, as long as you don't upset the status quo. I think it's kind of problematic if you have a status quo that is actually oppressive. So this is one of the ways that nowadays people have, there are a variety of people that have talked about the way that Heidegger's concept, the really problematic aspects of authenticity, becomes a force for like neoliberal oppression, because nobody wants to dismantle the actual source of oppression, at least according to the people that buy into the idea that capitalism
also, I think
is an economic source of oppression. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
His emphasis on like self-authentic, like being authentic to yourself too, I think also makes it much harder for the coordinated action of challenging and dismantling that system, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of solipsistic. You're on your own. I mean, I think that within Heidegger's thought, there are all sorts of defenses you could take, because he does actually think of, it would take me an hour to really unpack this, but he basically thinks that individual consciousness is something that arises out of a relationship, that the relationship between subjects and objects, between people, is prior to individual identity and individual authenticity.
Is this like Daltine stuff? Is this related to that? Or
yeah, but I don't have time to talk about that now. So, but yeah, cool. There are ways you could push back on that critique from within Heidegger. But I think that it's a pretty fair critique of at least a sort of superficial understanding of authenticity. That it's not really about changing an oppressive status quo. It's just about finding ways to make people that were on the margins become more efficient cogs in the machine. Anyway.
Cool.
All right. Yeah. Hope that answers some questions.
Yeah, that was illuminating.
Great. Okay. I will see you next time.
Cool.